Hey guys, so I'm here to do the rundown on Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is called The Dam and the Barrens. We find adult Eddie driving to Maine after getting off the train. And he is driving in style. He's driving to Maine in a big old limo. Because as you know, Eddie owns a limo company. And he trades off with other limo companies. And so he's going to get there and show off his driving skills, I guess. But as he's driving along in his limo, he's just thinking along the way about his love for his old crew, specifically Bill and Richie. Bill is his best friend, and he's just kind of thinking back on the times that he had with Bill, and also his love for Richie. Richie kind of seems like just this crazy character, as he's just described throughout the book. But Eddie seems to be fond of this craziness that's him. As they're describing him, it kind of reminds me of like Jim Carrey. You know, like Richie has this, he's always cracking jokes, he's always mouthing off, he always has something smart to say, but he's also doing it in like a very embellished, over-dramatic way, like an overacting way, and it can get him in trouble at times, and at other times it gets the other ones laughing. So Eddie's just kind of thinking about his love for, you know, Bill and Richie, and then he kind of drifts back into memory about the day in the Barrens, the day they built the dam. Because the dam seems to be like the definitive moment in their relationship, kind of like the sealing of their friendship. And he's just thinking about how they successfully built this dam, and how Ben was such a leader, and how he was just a natural builder, and he just knew how to build things without ever taking a class or ever even attempting it. As they're sitting there having fun, it's just Bill, Ed, and Ben at the time. Eddie noticed that Bill looks pretty distant. He doesn't really want to ask him what's wrong. He knows he probably should as a friend, but back then you don't really want to be called a sissy, so he doesn't want to pry into his life, you know, and feel like, you know, if Bill has something to say, he'll let him know. But for now, he's just giving him his space. Bill lets Ben know that Richie and Stanley will be coming, and that even though Ben gets teased for his weight and Bill gets teased for his stuttering, that the one who gets it the worst is Stanley, because Stanley gets teased and bullied for being Jewish. And this is 1950s, so I guess racism is pretty strong in this time. And I guess the worst thing you could be at that time is another race besides white, especially Jewish. So Stanley is always constantly getting beat up and always made fun of. Richie and Stanley eventually come, and they all decide to take off to the junkyard to get a bunch of junk, and they come back to reinforce the dam and successfully complete it. And so they're all celebrating, and they all pull out, Richie pulls out a pack of cigarettes, and Richie's kind of like addicted to cigarettes, I guess. He pulls them out quite a bit. But they all kick back and enjoy their handiwork. Only Stan and Eddie don't smoke. Stan is too clean cut, and Eddie is asthmatic. So they're just sitting there enjoying their quiet time. Ben secretly tries to put out his cigarette, because this was his actual first cigarette, and he didn't really like it. Eddie noticed and decided not to say anything. Stan was just sitting along watching birds. And then Bill kind of breaks the silence. Bill kind of breaks the relaxing moment and lets them know that he has something to tell them, that he's been stressing about something and that he's scared, but that if they laugh, he's going to be pissed off. All of them agree, except Eddie's kind of shaken. He feels like something bad is going to come out of Bill's mouth, and he doesn't really want to hear it. He keeps hoping somebody comes by to interrupt, because the more Bill starts to talk, the more he keeps thinking about an occurrence that happened to him on Neibolt Street. Now, Neibolt Street is not in the miniseries. I wish they would have included it, but they did not include it. But Neibolt Street is going to be represented in the new It. I know that, and it's talked about a lot in the book. So Bill starts to tell a story about what happened to him with the photo album, and after he's finished, everybody's just silent. Eddie's panicked inside. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to know anything. He sees the same fear on Stan and Ben's face, like something might have happened to them. And then now we go full flashback into what happened to Eddie on Neibolt Street. So kind of Eddie, when he didn't have anybody to play with, he would go spend time in the train yard. Most of the train yard was old and abandoned. There were always bums nearby, and that would freak him out. They hung out in the train yard and also in the empty homes on Neibolt Street. That was on the way to the train yard. So these bums would often harass them and ask, do you got a cigarette? Do you got a light? Do you got any change? But on this one occasion, Eddie was drawn to this house and went towards it, and this is what happened to him. One of these fellows had crawled out from under the porch of the house on 29 Neibolt Street, and one day he had offered to give Eddie a blowjob for a quarter. Eddie had backed away, the skin like ice, his mouth as dry as lint balls. One of the hobo's nostrils had been eaten away. You could look right into the red, scabby channel. I don't have a quarter, Eddie said, backing towards his bike. I'll do it for a dime, the hobo croaked, coming toward him. He was wearing old green flannel pants. Yellow puke was stiffening across the lap. He unzipped his fly and reached inside. He was trying to grin. His nose was a red horror. I don't have a dime either, Eddie said, and suddenly thought, oh my God, he's got leprosy. If he touches me, I'll catch it too. His control snapped and he ran. He heard the hobo break into a shuffling run behind him, his old string-tied shoes slapping and flapping across the riotous lawn of the empty saltbox house. Come back here, kid. I'll blow you for free. Come back here. Eddie had leapt on his bike, wheezing now, feeling his throat closing up to a pinhole. His chest had taken on weight. He hit the pedals and was just picking up speed when one of the hobo's hands struck the package carrier. The bike shimmied. Eddie looked over his shoulder and saw the hobo running along behind the rear wheel, gaining, his lips drawn back from the black stumps of his teeth in an expression which might have been either desperation or fury. In spite of the stones lying on his chest, Eddie had pedaled even faster, expecting that one of the hobo's scab-crusted hands would close over his arm at any moment, pulling him from his railing and dumping him in a ditch where God knows what would have happened to him. So that had happened to Eddie, and this is what he's kind of flashbacking on, but that's not the main thing that happened to him. This is just kind of like the beginning of his nightmare on Neibolt Street. So after that had happened, he did tell Bill and Richie one day when they were hanging out, and I wasn't gonna read this part, but I just think it's funny because it's funny how they kind of talk to each other. These aren't your normal everyday 10, 11-year-old kids. Definitely not the 10, 11-year-old kids we have now. And I grew up with 4 brothers, so my 4 brothers were pretty nasty at times, but I don't remember them ever talking this way specifically. I mean, I might have not just been in the room, but anyways, Eddie tells Richie and Bill about the hobo and his leprosy. Eddie held his terrible story inside for almost a week, and then he confided it to Richie Tozier and Bill Denbrawl one day when they were reading comics over the garage. He didn't have leprosy, dummy, Richie said. He had the syph. Eddie looked at Bill to see if Richie was ribbing him. He had never heard of a disease called the syph before. It sounded like something Richie might have made up. Is there such thing as the syph, Bill? Bill nodded gravely. Only it's syph, not sift. It's short for syphilis. What's that? It's a disease you get from fucking, Richie said. You know about fucking, don't you, Eds? Sure, Eddie said. He hoped he wasn't blushing. He knew that when you got older, stuff came out of your penis when it was hard. He knew that because Vincent Boogers Taliendo had filled him in on the rest. Sorry. I kind of lost track. Okay. He knew that when you got older, stuff came out of your penis when it was hard. Vincent Boogers Taliendo had filled him in on the rest one day at school. What you did when you fucked, according to Boogers, was you rubbed your cock against the girl's stomach until it got hard. Your cock, not the girl's stomach. Then you rubbed some more until you started to get the feeling. The feeling. When Eddie asked what that meant, Boogers had only shaken his head in a mysterious way. Boogers said that you couldn't describe it, but you know it as soon as you got it. He said you could practice by lying in the bathtub and rubbing your cock with ivory soap. Eddie had tried this, but the only feeling he got was the need to urinate after a while. Anyways, Boogers went on. After you got the feeling, the stuff came out of your penis. Most kids called it cum, Boogers said, but his big brother had told him the real scientific word for it was jism. And when you got the feeling, You had to grab your cock and aim it real fast so you could shoot the jism into the girl's belly button as soon as it came out. It went down into her stomach, and it made a baby there. Do girls like that? Eddie had asked Boogers Taliando. He himself was sort of appalled. I guess they must, Boogers had replied, looking mystified himself. Now listen up, Eds, Richie said, because there may be questions later. Some women have got this disease. Some men too, but mostly it's a woman. A guy can get it from a woman. Or another guy if they queer, Bill added. Right. The important thing is if you get the stiff from screwing someone who's already got it. What does it do? Eddie asked. Makes you rot, Richie said simply. Eddie stared at him, horrified. It's bad, I know, but it's true, Richie said. Your nose is the first thing to go. Some guys with the sif, their noses fall right off, and then their cocks. Please, Bill said. I just ate. Hey, man, this is science, Richie said. So what's the difference between leprosy and sif? Eddie asked. You don't get leprosy from fucking, Richie said promptly, and then went off into a gale of laughter that left both Bill and Eddie mystified. So, I know you didn't need to hear that part of the story, but I just thought it was funny. I like how they interact with each other, and I mean, you lose that by not reading the book. I'm definitely skipping over a whole lot just to give you the basics, but I thought that kind of interaction with each other was just kind of funny. Anyways, so Eddie had felt John back to the house a few weeks later. He had to see if the leper was still there. In his mind, this was a leper. He didn't think it was nothing, no bum with syphilis. But he kept thinking about it, and so he walked by the train yard, and he just felt drawn back to this house, and that he needed to find that he wasn't just imagining this leper. Where the leper had crawled out from was under the porch. So Eddie pushed through some stuff and looked under the porch, and there was a cruddy blanket that he pushed aside, and behind the blanket was a window, and it led into a basement. So this is what happened to Eddie. He leaned closer to the window, closer to the cellar darkness, breathing in that smell of age and must and dry rot. Closer and closer to the black, and surely the leper would have caught him in his asthma if his asthma hadn't picked up at that exact moment. It cramped his lungs with a weight that was painless yet frightening. His breath at once took on the familiar, hateful whistling sound. He drew back, and that was when the face appeared. It coming so sudden was so startling, and yet at the same time it was expected. Eddie could not have screamed, even if he hadn't been having an asthma attack. His eyes bulged, his mouth creaked open. It was not the hobo with the flayed nose, but there was resemblances, terrible resemblances, and yet this thing could not be human. Nothing could be so eaten up and remain alive. The skin of its forehead was split open, white bone coated with a membrane of yellow mucousy stuff. It peered through like the lens of a bleary searchlight. The nose was a bridge of raw gristle above two red flaring channels. One eye was a gleeful blue. The other socket was filled with mass of spongy brown-black tissue. The leper's lower lip sagged like liver. It had no upper lip at all. Its teeth poked out in a sneering ring. It shot one hand out through the broken pane. It shot the other through the dirty glass to the left, shattering it to fragments. Its questing, clutching hands crawled with sores. Beetles crawled and lumbered busily to and fro. Mewling, gasping, Eddie hunched his way backward. He could hardly breathe. His heart was the runaway engine in his chest. The leper appeared to be wearing with the ragged remains of some strange silvery suit. Things were crawling in the straggles of its brown hair. How about a blowjob, Eddie? The apparition croaked, grinning with its remains of a mouth. It lilted. Bobby does it for a dime. He will do it any time. 15 cents for overtime. And then it winked. That's me, Eddie, Bob Gray. And now that we've been properly introduced. One of its hands splattered against Eddie's right shoulder. Eddie screamed thinly. That's all right, the leper said, and Eddie saw with dreamlike terror that it was crawling out of the window. The bony shield behind its peeling forehead snapped a thin wooden strip between the two panes. Its hands clawed through the leafy, mulchy earth. The silver shoulders of its suit, costume, whatever it was, began to push through the gap. That one glaring blue eye never left Eddie's face. Here I come, Eddie, That's all right, it croaked. You'll like it down here with us. Some of your friends are down here. Its hand reached out again, and in some corner of his panic-maddened, screaming mind, Eddie was suddenly coldly sure that if the thing touched his bare skin, he would begin to rot too. The thought broke his paralysis. He skittered backward on his hands and knees, then turned and lunged for the far end of the porch. Sunlight falling in narrow, dusty beams through the cracks between the porch boards stripped his face from moment to moment. His head pushed through the dusty cobwebs that settled in his hair. He looked back over his shoulder and saw that the leper was halfway out. It won't do you any good to run, Eddie, it called. Eddie had reached the far end of the porch. There was latticework skirt there. The sun shone through it, printing diamonds of light on his cheeks and forehead. He lowered his head and slammed into it with no hesitation at all, tearing the entire skirt free with a scream of rusted halfpenny nails. There was a tangle of rose bushes beyond, and Eddie tore through these, stumbling to his feet as he did so, not feeling the thorns that scalded shallow cuts along his arms and cheeks and neck. He turned and backed away on buckling legs, pulling his aspirator out of his pocket, triggering it. Surely it hadn't really happened. He had been thinking about the hobo, and his mind just put on a show. It had shown him a movie, a horror movie, like one of those Saturday matinee pictures with Frankenstein and Wolfman that they had sometimes shown at the Buju or the Gym or the Aladdin. Sure, that was all. He had scared himself. What an asshole. There was even time to utter a shaky laugh at the unsuspected vividness of his imagination before the rotting hand shot out from under the porch, clawing at the rose bushes with mighty ferocity, pulling at them, stripping them, printing beads of blood on them. Eddie shrieked. The leper was crawling out. It was wearing a clown suit. He saw a clown suit with big orange buttons down the front. It saw Eddie and grinned. Its half mouth dropped open and its tongue lolled out. Eddie shrieked again, but no one could have heard one boy's breathless shriek under the pounding of the diesel engine in the train yard. The leper's tongue had not just dropped from its mouth. It was at least 3 feet long and had unrolled like a party favor. It came to an arrow point which dragged in the dirt. Foam, thicky, sticky, and yellowish, coursed along it. Bugs crawled all over it. The rose bushes, which had been showing the first touches of spring green when Eddie broke through them, now turned dead and lacy black. "Blow job," the leper whispered, and tottered to his feet. Eddie raced for his bike. It was the same race as before, only it now had the quality of a nightmare where you could only move with the most agonizing slowness, no matter how hard you tried to go fast. And in those dreams, didn't you always hear or feel something, some it gaining on you? Didn't you always smell its stinking breath, as Eddie was smelling it now? For a moment he felt a wild hope. Perhaps this really was a nightmare. Perhaps he would awake in his own bed, bathed in sweat, shaking, maybe even crying, but alive, safe. Then he pushed the thought away. Its charm was deadly, its comfort fatal. He did not try to mount his bike immediately. He ran with it instead, head down, pushing the handlebars. He felt as if he was drowning, not in water, but inside his own chest. "Blow job," the leper whispered again. "Come back any time, Eddie, and bring your friends." Its rotting fingers seemed to touch the back of his neck. Perhaps that was only a jangling strap of cobweb from under the porch, caught in his hair and brushing against his shrinking flesh. Eddie leaped onto his bike and pedaled away, not caring that his throat had closed up again, not giving 2 sucks for his asthma, not looking back. He didn't look back until he was almost home, and of course, when he did, there was nothing there. That night, lying straight as a poker in bed, one hand folded tightly around his aspirator, looking into the shadows, he heard the leper whisper, "It won't do you any good to run, Eddie." So, that is what happened to little Eddie Kasprak when he went go looking back for the leper on Neibolt Street. Which, I don't know about you, but if some crazy guy came with his skin rotting off of him, I would not go back. Unless I brought a quarter, if I was Eddie. A dime. He offered a dime at one point. But, kidding aside, I would not go back. But he felt being drawn there. And so he went to go investigate. And this time, whatever it was, gave chase to him. So Eddie... Remember, they're sitting around the Barrens, and Bill had just told his story, which sent Eddie into his flashback, and now Eddie is telling them his story. After Eddie's finished telling his story, Ben then tells them about the clown on the frozen canal. Richie doesn't really believe Ben or Eddie, but believes Bill because Bill is their leader, and he doesn't feel Bill will lie. They press Stan since he looks fearful. He gets mad and tells him to lay off. After pressing more, he finally says, it wasn't a clown, not for him. Then the cop comes down and interrupts Stan before he could tell his story. And that is the end of chapter 7. So, yeah, they all so far have a story to tell, except for Richie doesn't seem impressed. So, Richie at this time, nothing has really happened to him. Obviously, something's happened to Stan, and he doesn't get to finish his story because he's interrupted by the cop coming down. And what I find interesting about this is in the miniseries, they were all there when they were telling the stories. In this one, Bevy's not in there. She hasn't even been really introduced to their gang. Like, they know her, but she hasn't joined forces with them yet. So, that is the end of chapter 7. We had them building the dam at the Barrens, and then Bill letting the rest of them know what has been going on, which the rest of them then told their stories, and we hear about the traumatic moment for Eddie. And that is it. So if you guys have any questions, just go ahead and feel free to ask, and I'll answer it or look it up. And until chapter 8, guys. All right, bye.